People say they value kindness, integrity, and moral character. Then they consistently choose leaders, partners, and associates based on completely different criteria. This gap between stated values and actual behavior reveals something fundamental about human psychology that most prefer not to acknowledge. Observe how this plays out in any social hierarchy. The person who gets promoted is rarely the most ethical. The individual who gains influence is seldom the most generous. The leader who commands respect typically demonstrates strength, competence, and strategic thinking rather than moral superiority. This pattern appears so consistently across cultures, industries, and time periods that it suggests something deeper than social conditioning. It points to evolutionary programming that prioritizes survival-relevant traits over abstract moral principles. Humans evolved in environments where following strong leaders increased survival probability more than following moral ones. A virtuous leader who cannot protect the tribe from threats becomes irrelevant quickly. A ruthless leader who ensures group survival earns loyalty regardless of their moral character. These instincts persist in modern environments where physical survival is rarely at stake. People still gravitate towards strength, competence, and decisiveness because these traits signal the ability to navigate complex challenges and create favorable outcomes. The confusion arises because modern society teaches that moral behavior should be rewarded while simultaneously operating through systems that reward strength and competence. This creates cognitive dissonance that most people resolve by telling themselves that successful people must also be good people. Watch how this unfolds in professional settings. The colleague who always volunteers for extra work, never pushes back on unreasonable demands, and prioritizes others' needs consistently receives less recognition than the one who sets clear boundaries, demands fair compensation, and pursues strategic objectives. The accommodating person is seen as reliable but not leadership material. Their willingness to sacrifice their own interests signals that they lack the strength necessary to advance organizational objectives when external pressure emerges. The strategically minded person who balances cooperation with self-interest demonstrates the kind of thinking required for leadership roles. They show they can make difficult decisions, prioritize effectively, and maintain focus on results, rather than being distracted by the need to please everyone. This dynamic operates independently of actual moral character. The accommodating person may have superior ethical instincts, but they display those instincts in ways that signal weakness rather than strength. The strategic person may have identical moral principles, but they implement those principles through approaches that demonstrate competence and decisiveness. Consider how this plays out in romantic relationships. People claim to want partners who are kind, caring, and emotionally supportive, yet dating patterns consistently show attraction to confidence, ambition, and emotional stability rather than pure altruism. The person who constantly sacrifices their own needs for others often finds themselves taken for granted or abandoned for partners who maintain stronger personal boundaries. The individual who balances generosity with self-respect typically builds more sustainable and satisfying relationships. This happens because strength signals the ability to provide security and stability in uncertain environments. Excessive altruism signals potential inability to make necessary hard decisions when circumstances require them. Political systems demonstrate these principles at scale. Voters consistently claim to prioritize honesty, empathy, and moral leadership. Electoral outcomes consistently favor candidates who project strength, competence, and the ability to achieve desired results. The candidate who emphasizes their good intentions and moral character without demonstrating strategic capability rarely gains significant support. The candidate who presents clear plans for addressing problems and the strength to implement those plans typically prevails. This occurs because voters subconsciously understand that good intentions without execution capability produce poor outcomes. They prefer leaders who can navigate complex political realities and deliver results rather than those who maintain moral purity but achieve nothing. Business environments amplify these dynamics because results are measurable and competition is explicit. The executive who makes popular decisions that harm long-term organizational health loses respect from stakeholders regardless of their moral motivations. The leader who makes difficult decisions that serve organizational objectives gains respect even when those decisions create short-term dissatisfaction. This happens because business stakeholders understand that strength and strategic thinking determine survival in competitive markets. The most effective business leaders combine moral principles with strategic execution. They do not abandon ethics, but they implement ethical approaches through methods that demonstrate competence and strength rather than weakness or indecision. Social hierarchies operate through similar mechanisms. The person who constantly seeks approval, avoids conflict, and prioritizes harmony over effectiveness typically occupies lower status positions regardless of their moral character. The individual who states their positions clearly, engages in productive conflict when necessary, and focuses on achieving results tends to gain influence and respect. They signal the kind of thinking that produces favorable outcomes in challenging situations. This does not mean that moral character is irrelevant. It means that moral character without demonstrated competence and strength rarely generates the respect necessary for leadership roles or significant influence. Educational systems often fail to prepare people for this reality because they emphasize compliance, cooperation, and following established rules rather than strategic thinking and strength development. Students learn to succeed within structured environments that reward different behaviors than those required for success in competitive adult contexts. The transition from academic environments to professional ones often proves difficult for individuals who have not developed strategic thinking capabilities alongside their moral principles. They discover that good intentions and hard work alone are insufficient for advancement in systems where results and strategic positioning matter more than effort and character. Family dynamics also reflect these principles. Children consistently show more respect for parents who set clear boundaries and follow through on consequences than for those who prioritize being liked over being effective. The parent who avoids conflict and makes popular decisions often finds their authority undermined when difficult situations require decisive action. The parent who maintains consistent standards and demonstrates strength in enforcing them typically commands greater long-term respect and cooperation. This happens because children intuitively understand that weak authority figures cannot protect them from external threats or guide them through complex decisions. They gravitate towards strength because it signals competence and reliability in challenging circumstances. Religious and ideological movements demonstrate how moral systems themselves often reward strength over pure virtue. The leaders who gain significant influence typically combine moral messaging with strategic capability and organizational strength. The purely virtuous individual who lacks strategic thinking or organizational skills rarely builds movements that create lasting change. The strategically minded person who understands how to mobilize resources and navigate opposition typically achieves greater impact even if their personal virtue is questionable. This pattern suggests that effective moral leadership requires understanding how power operates rather than avoiding power dynamics altogether. The most influential moral leaders throughout history combined ethical principles with sophisticated strategic thinking. Historical examples consistently show this principle in operation. Military leaders who prioritized moral purity over strategic effectiveness rarely achieved lasting success. Political reformers who focus solely on moral arguments without building power bases typically failed to implement their reforms. The figures who created significant positive change combined moral vision with strategic competence. They understood that good intentions without the power to implement them produce no beneficial outcomes. Modern media and social systems have created new ways for people to signal virtue while avoiding the strategic thinking necessary to create actual positive change. Social media platforms reward performative morality that generates attention rather than strategic action that produces results. The person who posts constantly about social causes while taking no meaningful action receives more recognition than the individual who quietly implements programs that address those causes effectively. This dynamic separates moral performance from moral achievement. Professional environments often reflect similar patterns. The employee who talks extensively about company values while contributing minimally to actual objectives receives less respect than the colleague who focuses on results while maintaining ethical standards in their methods. The disconnect between moral signaling and moral effectiveness creates opportunities for strategic individuals to combine ethical principles with competent execution. They can achieve both moral objectives and professional advancement by focusing on outcomes rather than recognition. Financial systems demonstrate how strength and competence determine resource allocation more than moral character. Investors consistently choose opportunities based on projected returns and risk assessment rather than the moral character of entrepreneurs or executives. The business leader who demonstrates strategic capability and execution strength attracts investment regardless of their personal virtue. The morally superior individual who lacks business competence rarely secures the resources necessary to implement their vision. This occurs because financial markets operate on measurable results rather than subjective moral assessments. Investors understand that good intentions without strategic capability typically produce poor financial outcomes. Legal systems reveal similar dynamics. Attorneys who combine legal knowledge with strategic thinking and negotiation strength typically achieve better outcomes for their clients than those who rely solely on moral arguments. The lawyer who demonstrates competence in navigating legal complexities and building persuasive cases commands more respect from colleagues, clients, and judges than the one who emphasizes moral character without strategic capability. This happens because legal systems operate through procedural mechanisms that require strategic navigation rather than pure moral argumentation. Success requires understanding how the system actually functions rather than how it theoretically should function. Therapeutic and counseling relationships also demonstrate these principles. Clients typically show greater respect for therapists who demonstrate competence in addressing their problems rather than those who only provide emotional support without strategic guidance. The counselor who combines empathy with practical problem-solving approaches typically achieves better outcomes and higher client satisfaction than the one who focuses solely on emotional validation. The pattern emerges because people seeking therapeutic help need strategic guidance for navigating complex life challenges, not just moral support. They respect strength and competence that can actually address their problems. International relations operate entirely through these dynamics. Nations consistently align with strong partners who can provide security and economic benefits rather than weak partners who only offer moral solidarity. The country that demonstrates strategic capability and resource strength attracts allies regardless of their domestic policies. The nation that emphasizes moral principles without strategic power typically finds limited international support when facing threats. This occurs because international systems operate through power dynamics rather than moral principles. National leaders understand that survival and prosperity require strategic alliances with capable partners. Understanding why people respect strength before morality does not require abandoning ethical principles. It requires implementing those principles through approaches that demonstrate competence and strategic thinking rather than weakness or indecision. The most effective approach combines moral foundations with strategic execution. This creates sustainable influence that can achieve both ethical objectives and practical results. The individual who understands these dynamics can position themselves to gain the respect necessary for implementing positive changes rather than remaining powerless to address problems they care about. This perspective changes how one approaches leadership development, relationship building, and strategic positioning in competitive environments. It suggests focusing on competence development alongside character development rather than treating them as separate or conflicting priorities. The observer who recognizes these patterns can identify why certain individuals gain influence while others remain marginalized despite superior moral character. They can adjust their own approach to combine ethical principles with strategic effectiveness. Most importantly, this understanding provides a framework for achieving moral objectives through methods that actually work in competitive human systems, rather than methods that only work in theoretical or cooperative environments. The strategic moralist develops strength not to abandon ethical principles, but to gain the power necessary to implement those principles effectively in environments where good intentions alone produce no beneficial outcomes. Technology industries provide clear examples of how technical competence commands respect over moral positioning. Engineers who can solve complex problems receive more recognition than those who advocate for ethics without demonstrating capability. Startup environments amplify this dynamic because results become the primary metric for evaluation. Entrepreneurs who can attract customers and build scalable operations receive support regardless of their personal character. Sales environments demonstrate how persuasion capability commands respect independently of moral character. The salesperson who achieves revenue targets receives recognition regardless of their ethics. Sports organizations operate through performance-based systems. Athletes who contribute to winning receive respect regardless of personal character. Competence matters more than virtue when outcomes are measurable. Medical environments show how clinical competence commands respect. Physicians who can diagnose conditions and provide treatments receive recognition regardless of bedside manner. Academic institutions demonstrate how intellectual competence commands respect. Professors who advance knowledge receive tenure regardless of personal character. Military organizations provide direct examples of how strength commands authority. Officers who make effective decisions receive promotions regardless of virtue. Legal professions show how strategic thinking commands respect. Attorneys who achieve favorable outcomes receive referrals regardless of ethics. Consulting industries reveal how problem-solving capability commands respect. Consultants who provide strategic guidance receive recognition regardless of character. Financial services demonstrate how resource management competence commands respect. Advisors who generate returns receive recognition regardless of virtue. Real estate professionals show how negotiation capability commands respect. Agents who close transactions receive referrals regardless of character. Creative industries demonstrate how artistic competence commands respect. Artists who produce engaging work receive recognition regardless of personal lives. Non-profit organizations reveal how strategic capability commands respect in mission-driven environments. Leaders who achieve Measurable outcomes receive support regardless of virtue. Religious organizations demonstrate patterns between moral authority and organizational competence. Leaders who grow congregations receive respect regardless of theological purity. Understanding these patterns allows for strategic approaches to combining moral principles with effective action. The individual who develops both ethical foundations and competence capabilities can achieve moral objectives through methods that work in competitive environments. This requires shifting focus from moral signaling to moral effectiveness, from character performance to character implementation through strategic action. The combination creates sustainable influence that serves both ethical goals and practical advancement. The strategic approach recognizes that moral objectives often require power to implement, and power flows toward demonstrated competence rather than virtue alone. Developing strength serves ethical purposes when directed toward moral objectives. The observer who understands why people respect strength before morality can position themselves to gain influence necessary for implementing positive changes rather than remaining powerless to address problems they care about solving. Corporate environments demonstrate this dynamic clearly. Executives who navigate organizational politics and deliver results receive recognition regardless of personal ethics. Shareholders evaluate leaders based on their ability to generate returns rather than personal virtue. Partnership dynamics in professional services follow similar patterns. Law firms and consulting companies promote partners based on revenue generation and business development rather than moral character alone. Clients respect partners who achieve favorable outcomes more than those who simply maintain ethical practices. Educational leadership positions show how administrative competence commands respect. School principals and university presidents receive recognition based on their ability to manage resources and achieve institutional objectives rather than academic virtue alone. Entrepreneurial ventures reveal how execution capability commands respect from investors and employees. Venture capitalists invest in teams that demonstrate strategic capability rather than those presenting moral missions without business competence. International business environments demonstrate how competence commands respect across cultures. Global partnerships form based on strategic capability rather than shared values or moral alignment. Crisis leadership situations provide clear examples of how strength commands respect during challenging periods. Leaders who make difficult decisions and navigate uncertainty receive support regardless of moral character. Professional athletics demonstrate these principles at visible scales. Team owners and coaches receive recognition based on building winning organizations rather than personal virtue. Media and entertainment industries reveal how audience engagement capability commands respect. Artists who create content that attracts audiences receive recognition regardless of personal lives or moral positions. Investment sectors demonstrate how analytical competence commands respect. Portfolio managers who generate positive returns receive recognition regardless of personal ethics. Healthcare administration positions show how operational competence commands respect. Hospital executives receive recognition based on delivering quality care while managing organizational challenges. The pattern remains consistent. Competence at achieving outcomes others value generates more sustainable respect than moral character without demonstrated capability. This understanding enables strategic approaches to combining ethical principles with effective action in competitive environments. The strategic individual develops both moral foundations and practical competence, using ethical behavior to build trust while demonstrating capabilities that deliver results. This combination addresses both competitive requirements and relationship sustainability. The most effective approach recognizes that moral objectives often require power to implement, and power flows toward demonstrated competence rather than virtue alone. Developing strength serves ethical purposes when directed toward moral objectives through strategic action.